In the remote hills of eastern Kentucky, 43 miles from what would become Lexington, sits a sealed copper mine closed by authorities in 1847. Officially, it was shut down due to structural issues, but the truth buried in those tunnels tells a far darker story. From 1792 to 1845, the Hartwell family extracted over 2 million pounds of copper, becoming one of early America's richest mining dynasties. Yet by 1845, not a single Hartwell was left alive to enjoy the wealth. When investigators finally entered the mine, they discovered not just evidence of advanced techniques decades ahead of their time, but chilling records of systematic human suffering spanning 3 generations. The Hartwell copper was remarkably pure, commanding top prices from Louisville to New Orleans. Strangely, the family lived in near isolation, venturing into town only for bare essentials. Despite their primitive tools, they consistently extracted high-quality ore, baffling local officials. Mining surveys showed they used techniques not formally developed until 50 years later. But the most disturbing discovery was a trove of handwritten documentation, chronicling suffering, experimentation, and a chilling understanding of human anatomy and labor control. What makes this case even more unsettling is the trail of evidence. Records, mining logs, and personal letters survived untouched in a courthouse basement until 1963, when a mysterious fire destroyed most of them. The few surviving documents were quietly transferred to federal custody under such secrecy that even the county clerk wasn't told where they were going. The Hartwells story began in 1792, the year Kentucky joined the Union. As settlers surged west through the Cumberland Gap, 3 Hartwell brothers, Caleb, 34, Silas, 32, and Jeremiah, 25, arrived in search of opportunity. Armed with little more than mining tools from their father's failed Pennsylvania ironworks and the scars of a family legacy poisoned by metal dust, they were determined to carve a future from stone. Their father Tobias and grandfather Ezekiel both died young from lung diseases caused by years in the mines. Their mother Sarah died in childbirth, her health ravaged by a life in a house thick with copper dust. These early deaths forced the brothers to raise themselves in brutal conditions, instilling a belief that wealth wasn't inherited, it was ripped from the earth with calloused hands and ruthless resolve. Caleb was the strategist. His preserved letters reveal a man of precision and secrecy, skilled in negotiation and metallurgy, despite no formal education. His handwriting and technical knowledge suggested a hidden intellect shaped by necessity. Silas brought physical endurance and experience, managing dangerous labor operation skills he'd honed overseeing mines that used both free and enslaved workers in Pennsylvania. His role in the Hartwell operations would later reflect a disturbing focus on what he called labor efficiency. Jeremiah, the youngest, possessed an uncanny ability to read rock and locate untouched copper veins. His secret weapon was a journal passed down from his grandfather, filled with experimental mining techniques, chemical recipes, and medical notes gathered over decades of industrial toil. They settled in a secluded valley where 3 streams met an area known as Copper Basin, marked by green-streaked rock faces. Most had written the land off as too remote, but the Hartwells saw that isolation as a shield. Their first cabin overlooked the valley, strategically placed to spot any intruders. What happened next would elevate them into unimaginable wealth and doom them to a legacy soaked in secrecy, suffering, and suspicion. The Hartwell brothers' cabin in the Kentucky hills was no ordinary shelter. Built with thick stone walls, narrow window slits that doubled as defensive positions, and a root cellar that tunneled unusually deep into the hillside, it looked more like a fortress than a miner's hut. Early visitors to the site reported feeling deeply unwelcome, sensing that the brothers weren't just digging for copper, they were preparing for a siege. On the Kentucky frontier, where justice rode on horseback and land disputes often ended in bloodshed, paranoia was survival. Violence was a constant threat, and the Hartwells, suspicious and secretive by nature, fit right in. They brokered fragile alliances with local native tribes, not out of goodwill, but to set up early warning systems. For labor, they hired drifters and desperate men workers who almost always disappeared after only a few weeks. By late 1792, the brothers struck a discovery that would alter their fate, a vein of copper so pure and vast. The Caleb's early estimates claimed it could be mined for generations. But this wasn't just copper. The ore was laced with arsenic, lead, and mercury, a combination that made the metal extraordinarily valuable and dangerously toxic. Their secret assays in Louisville confirmed both the ore's unmatched purity and its lethal potential. The Hartwells, whose family history was riddled with deaths from metal poisoning, immediately understood both the promise and the peril. They had found their fortune, but also inherited their curse. What began as a mining enterprise was swiftly becoming something much darker. By the winter of 1794, the first undeniable signs of danger emerged. Jeremiah, the youngest brother, returned from a deep shaft, complaining of severe headaches and breathing problems. At first, his brothers dismissed it as exhaustion. But soon, dark discoloration crept up his arms. His coordination failed, and his energy waned. Still, he didn't seek help. Instead, he wrote. His journal, discovered decades later, chronicled his decline with chilling precision. He wasn't documenting his illness to understand it. He was treating himself as a test subject. His entries are cold and analytical. Day 12. Discoloration has reached elbow joint. Tremors interfere with motor control 3 hours post-exposure. Symptoms progressing faster than father's higher compound concentrations suspected. These were not the words of a man fighting for his life, but of someone gathering data on himself. In early 1795, Dr. Marcus Pendleton, one of the few trained physicians in the region, made the arduous 3-day trip to examine Jeremiah. What he found disturbed him deeply. Jeremiah's blue-green skin tremors and erratic behavior were textbook signs of prolonged metal exposure. Yet when Pendleton questioned the brothers about their mining methods, they grew guarded and combative. Caleb in particular seemed far more interested in the mechanics of metal poisoning than in curing it. Pendleton's journal, later discovered in the archives of a Louisville medical college, offers a haunting insight. The eldest brother asked if the damage could be reversed. When I explained that much of it was likely permanent, he appeared satisfied, even intrigued. It became clear this was not an illness to them. It was an opportunity. The doctor came to a horrifying conclusion. Jeremiah's condition wasn't a tragic accident. It was a controlled experiment. The Hartwells weren't trying to save him. They were testing the effects of chronic exposure carefully, modulating the dose to see how long a man could endure before breaking. The toxic metals in their mine had transformed it into a laboratory of suffering. And while copper poured from the earth, and their fortunes multiplied, so too did their knowledge of human endurance under chemical assault. Jeremiah wasn't a casualty. He was a calculation. The Hartwell brothers, fully aware of the toxic dangers buried in their copper vein, did not attempt to shield themselves. Instead, they meticulously crafted their mining operation to serve a darker purpose, to study the effects of long-term exposure to arsenic, lead, and mercury on the human body. Each shift was logged with scientific precision. Meals were measured to monitor how different foods influenced metal absorption. Symptoms were charted daily, not for treatment, but for data. In spring 1796, the experiment reached its first grim milestone. Jeremiah collapsed in the mine's deepest tunnel, his body convulsing violently, his lips and nails darkening to the blue-black hue the brothers remembered from their father's final hours. Yet they didn't rush to save him. They documented his decline first. His last words weren't cries for help. They were observations, vision, narrowing metallic taste, intensifying muscle control, deteriorating in a predictable sequence, cognitive clarity intact. His death marked what Caleb would later describe as the successful conclusion of Phase 1. They buried Jeremiah in an unmarked grave above the mine, but not before conducting what Caleb called a final examination. Using rudimentary tools and inherited knowledge, he performed a crude autopsy. His journal described Jeremiah's liver saturated with copper bones, laced with lead and mercury deposits visible in the brain. Caleb's conclusion: future subjects should be exposed longer to improve data collection. By 1797, Caleb and Silas themselves were showing signs of poisoning, but their priorities had shifted. Deep in the mine, they stumbled upon evidence that they were not the first to dig there. Stone tools and unfinished tunnels hinted at a long-lost mining culture, while scattered skeletons told a haunting story. Many of the bones bore the same green stains, now creeping across their own skin. But some were different, complete skeletons, showing signs of survival, even adaptation. These individuals had clearly endured the poisoning for years, not months. The implications shook them. What they had thought was a curse was now a form of trial, one that others before them had survived through careful control and sacrifice. They were no longer victims of a deadly mine. They were competitors in a brutal process of natural selection. Those who managed exposure scientifically might live long enough to profit. Those who didn't became part of the mine's growing graveyard. The Hartwell mine might have faded into obscurity as just another grim chapter of frontier hardship, if not for a chilling discovery in 1823. Samuel Crawford, a land surveyor mapping new county boundaries, uncovered something unexpected. A hillside ravine just 200 yards from the mine entrance, marked by dozens of crude stone cairns, shallow unmarked graves arranged with unnatural precision. Initially thought to be ancient, the truth was far worse. Crawford's team began digging to assess if the graves predated European settlement, a key issue in determining land ownership. But what they found disturbed them deeply. The remains weren't ancient, they were modern. Fragments of cloth buttons and tools tied the bodies to the late 1700s and early 1800s, squarely during the Hartwell mining era. More than that, the bones told their own horrifying tale. Many showed unmistakable signs of heavy metal poisoning, green copper stains, lead-induced brittleness, and skeletal deformities linked to prolonged arsenic exposure. But the most gut-wrenching discovery was the nature of the victims. Of the 47 sets of remains, at least 30 were children, some no older than toddlers. Others had reached adulthood before succumbing. These were not accidental deaths. The evidence suggested long-term exposure, slow decline, and systematic exploitation. The graves revealed that the Hartwell operation had grown far beyond what anyone had imagined. The mine wasn't just a site of industrial ambition, it had become a hidden laboratory of human suffering. And the true cost of their wealth was written not in ledgers, but in bones, buried under Kentucky's soil. The deformities found in the children's skeletons weren't consistent with accidental exposure or brief contact with toxic metals. Instead, they displayed slow, progressive deterioration, the kind that only forms under prolonged, deliberate exposure. These children hadn't stumbled into danger. They had been placed in it, and someone had been carefully watching, measuring, and waiting as the poisons took their toll. In his official report to the Kentucky Territorial Government surveyor, Samuel Crawford chose his words with caution. But in private letters to his brother, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives, his true horror is revealed. He described the Hartwell site not as an abandoned mining camp, but as the scene of a systematic decades-long operation in human experimentation and murder. The number of children buried in the shallow graves was staggering. It couldn't be explained by disease or famine. It suggested intentional long-term poisoning on an organized scale. Crawford sealed the site and swore his men to silence, convinced they had only glimpsed a sliver of the truth. Soon, the dam of silence broke. Locals, encouraged by the official inquiry, began sharing stories they had kept buried for decades. The picture that emerged was darker than anyone had imagined. Martha Hensley, whose family owned land neighboring the Hartwells, testified that the mine emitted sounds that haunted her for years. Not the clang of pickaxes, but the cries of children. Not like when adults cry, she recalled, but the way a child screams when it's truly alone, truly in pain. Her husband once tried to investigate, but Caleb Hartwell met him at the mine entrance with a rifle and a cold explanation shifting equipment. But as Martha said, equipment doesn't beg for its mother. Other families told of seeing small sickly figures slipping into the mine at dusk. Children malnourished and terrified vanishing at the first sign of company. The Hartwells never brought workers into town. They purchased chains, locks, and surgical tools under the guise of equipment maintenance. Samuel Wickham, the local shopkeeper, found it odd but said little until reports from traveling merchants confirmed his worst fears. These outsiders described workers, many of them young, showing visible signs of metal poisoning, blue-tinted skin, trembling limbs, swollen joints. When pressed, Caleb would dismiss them as family members suffering from a hereditary condition. But the number of afflicted individuals didn't match the size of the known Hartwell lineage. Then came the economic mystery. Despite the vast volume of copper being extracted, there were no records of Hartwell ore ever being sold through official channels. It was vanishing into the economy without a trace. Trade logs from Louisville revealed large shipments of copper moving quietly down the Ohio River, registered under false names and untraceable aliases. The Hartwells weren't just running a hidden mine, they were part of a sprawling smuggling network. Their operation, shrouded in secrecy, extended into the criminal underworld, providing metal for industrial buyers who never asked questions. By 1825, the Hartwell mine had entered local legend. Parents warned their children to stay away from the sealed tunnels. Travelers reported hearing voices echoing from the earth, pleas for help, cries of pain, metal striking stone. Some dismissed these tales as folklore, but the consistency of the stories was difficult to ignore. In certain seasons, a foul odor wafted downwind, a mix of decay and metal, sharp enough to drive people indoors. Decades later, chemical tests would confirm that the scent matched decomposition in a metal-saturated environment, specifically the decay of human remains. The revelation that finally pierced the veil came unexpectedly. In 1834, during construction of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, engineers began surveying a route through the Cumberland Gap. Chief Engineer Thomas Wickham brought advanced drilling equipment and geologic expertise far beyond that of earlier explorers. While drilling test shafts through the limestone ridges, Wickham's team accidentally intersected a complex underground system. What they assumed to be natural caverns would soon prove to be something much more calculated, an engineered labyrinth linked directly to the long-forgotten Hartwell mine, and to secrets far worse than anyone had dared imagine. The discovery began as a routine engineering task. While testing the soil for railroad foundation work in 1834, Thomas Wickham's survey team broke through into what they assumed was a shallow cavern 30 feet below ground. But this was no natural cave. What they had accidentally exposed was a vast hand-excavated tunnel system that honeycombed the hills around the abandoned Hartwell claim, an underground complex stretching for miles, connecting multiple valleys like a hidden city carved into the bedrock. These tunnels were not the work of unskilled miners. They featured ventilation shafts, drainage channels, and advanced support structures, all evidence of engineering expertise that should have been far beyond the reach of a family of frontier laborers. Wickham, a trained engineer himself, was astonished. The construction mirrored the complexity of military bunkers or early European catacombs, not Appalachian mine shafts. It was as if the Hartwells had access to knowledge reserved for elite architects or had developed it through decades of experimentation in complete isolation. Even more disturbing was what they found inside. The tunnel system was not simply a network of mining routes. It was a prison. Side chambers throughout the tunnels had been used as long-term living spaces, but these weren't shelters. Iron rings were embedded into the rock, many of them stained with what at first appeared to be rust, but was later confirmed as dried blood. Chains and restraints sized for both adults and children were scattered throughout the chambers. Some of the devices were grotesquely specific, custom-fitted to hold individuals of different sizes and conditions. These were not tools of restraint for unruly workers. They were instruments of long-term captivity. The layout of the tunnels made the purpose clearer. Those closest to the surface held individuals capable of labor. The deeper chambers held those who were sick, disabled, or dying. The further underground one traveled, the more grim the surroundings became. The Hartwells had organized their prisoners not just by labor role, but by stages of poisoning. It was a perverse production line using human beings as both tools and test subjects. At the furthest edge of the accessible tunnels, Wickham's team uncovered the final piece of the puzzle, the Hartwell family's records. Hundreds of pages stored in sealed stone niches had survived decades underground. The earliest pages were in Caleb Hartwell's meticulous hand. Later entries in different scripts proved that the work had been continued by multiple generations. At least 4 individuals contributed to the journals and ledgers, none of whom appeared in any public record. What these pages revealed was nothing less than a comprehensive system of human experimentation. Each journal contained detailed medical observations, data on toxicity levels, timelines of exposure, and even economic assessments of the useful lifespan of each subject. Beginning just 2 years after Jeremiah's death, Caleb had committed himself fully to the study of toxic metals and their impact on the human body. At first, his notes framed the experiments as grim necessity. If we are to profit from this mine while managing the inevitable poisoning, he wrote in 1798, we must understand its effects and learn to optimize the balance between productivity and survival. But as the records progressed, that pragmatic tone gave way to something far colder. The operation evolved from reluctant self-study to deliberate exploitation. Test subjects were no longer just family. They were abducted or purchased labor categorized by age, weight, health, and resilience. Each was assigned a code. Each had their symptoms tracked, their suffering systematized. The ledgers showed that by the early 1800s, the Hartwells had abandoned any pretense of ethical restraint. Human lives were assigned monetary value based on how long they could work before their bodies collapsed. Experiments included dietary manipulation, chemical dosing, and physical stress endurance. Children were subjected to modified regimens to see if they absorbed poisons differently. Some entries measured not just the physical breakdown of the subjects, but their psychological deterioration, tracking the onset of delirium, hallucinations, and mental collapse. In effect, the Hartwell tunnels had become an underground laboratory, a hidden institution of cruelty operating for over 4 decades beneath the hills of Kentucky. And while the surface world moved on, expanding westward and building new railroads, this family carved out its legacy in silence, in darkness, and in blood. What Wickham's team had uncovered was not just a forgotten mine. It was one of the most horrific and methodical systems of human experimentation in American history. and it had operated in secret for more than 40 years, hidden beneath the facade of a frontier copper claim. By the early 1800s, Caleb Hartwell had become fully obsessed with the systematic study of mineral poisoning, not to prevent death, but to manage it. His goal was as cold as it was calculating: determine the precise balance of toxic exposure that would maximize copper output while delaying worker death just long enough to avoid the cost of constant replacement. The Hartwells weren't dying by accident. They were orchestrating a human experiment, sacrificing themselves and others in the pursuit of industrial efficiency and profit. The earliest subjects had been family. But by 1801, the records shift to a broader, more organized scope. The term labor recruitment appears repeatedly, an intentionally vague euphemism masking an operation of human trafficking, abduction, and exploitation. The Hartwells acquired their victims through multiple channels. Slave traders in New Orleans sold them damaged goods, enslaved people too sick or injured for plantation work. Immigration brokers in Baltimore and Charleston supplied recent arrivals with no local ties. And most horrifying of all, the family paid bounties to frontier kidnappers for healthy children and young adults from isolated communities, victims who could disappear without consequence. The meticulous documentation left behind detailed the entire process from acquisition to exposure to death. Victims were labeled by type, cataloged by age, physical characteristics, and what the records called experimental suitability. These weren't just forced laborers. They were test subjects selected based on how useful their physiology might be for certain toxicology studies. When Wickham's railroad team uncovered the records, the scale of the operation stunned state authorities. But they were unprepared to deal with what they'd found. It wasn't just a historic crime scene. It was a vast, methodically executed program involving hundreds of victims, decades of records, and disturbing implications for broader societal complicity. The investigation took a sharp turn when Dr. Heinrich Müller, a respected German immigrant physician based in Louisville, was brought in to analyze the documents. Specializing in industrial toxicology, Müller immediately recognized symptoms that matched his own research. But what shocked him most was the depth of knowledge reflected in the records. Caleb Hartwell had documented the chemical properties of arsenic, lead, and mercury with a precision far beyond what was available in American medical literature at the time. The ledgers contained accurate dosage tables, detailed anatomical drawings, and experimental methodologies that mirrored the cutting-edge toxicology research being conducted in Europe decades ahead of frontier medicine. Müller noted references to restricted medical texts, secret industrial chemical formulas, and experimental procedures found only in elite academic centers. This raised serious questions about Caleb's background. Official records described the Hartwells as uneducated laborers. But the writings revealed that Caleb was operating at the level of a university-trained researcher. Someone, perhaps an underground medical network, had trained or supplied him with knowledge far beyond his documented station. Further research into the family's origins revealed that their father, Tobias Hartwell, had run an ironworks in Pennsylvania. But he had also acted as an informal physician for the local mining community, performing experimental treatments and surgeries. His reputation was controversial, regarded by some as a miracle worker, and by others as dangerously reckless. Tobias may have been the original source of the family's obsession with mining-related medical experimentation. This changed the narrative. The Hartwells weren't isolated villains corrupted by harsh conditions. They were heirs to a secretive and evolving traditions of industrial human experimentation passed from father to sons and refined over generations. Dr. Müller's deeper analysis of the records revealed that the Hartwells hadn't acted alone. Hidden in the margins were letters, codes, and ledgers documenting a broader criminal network. The Hartwells had been exchanging metals for people. Copper and arsenic, traded discreetly, were used to purchase human test subjects. Their contacts were scattered across Kentucky and neighboring states, traders, kidnappers, intermediaries, identified only by initials or code names. These documents included bills of sale for enslaved individuals, indentured servants, immigrants, and orphans acquired from as far away as Baltimore and New Orleans. This was no longer just a case of local abuse. It was a multi-state human trafficking and medical experimentation operation. Between 1801 and 1843, over 200 individuals and children, the elderly, the ill, the vulnerable, were funneled into the Hartwell tunnels. Their common trait, they had no one to come looking for them. The records also revealed the ruthless logic behind the system. Victims were assigned economic value not by age or strength alone, but by how long they could be exposed before dying and how much labor could be extracted in that window. Children were subjected to long-term exposure trials. Adults were categorized by stamina and resilience. Every death, every illness, every deformity was a data point used to refine what Caleb called the exposure curve, the ideal timeline of productivity before physiological collapse. In short, the Hartwell mine was not just a place of profit or labor. It was a factory of suffering, a clinical laboratory built beneath the earth, engineered to convert human lives into toxic data and copper. And for over 40 years, it operated in secret, supplying metal to the growing American economy while destroying lives in the name of science and control. Caleb Hartwell's records revealed a horrifying calculus. Healthy adult subjects yielded optimal copper output over an 18-month exposure cycle. In that time, a single individual could extract copper valued at several times their acquisition and maintenance cost. Children, though physically weaker and less economically efficient, were essential for research on how toxic metals affected growing bodies. Elderly subjects whose deaths could be more easily masked as natural were relegated to purely experimental roles, their suffering serving scientific ends rather than economic ones. What shattered any illusion that the Hartwell operation was a rogue family enterprise was a trove of letters uncovered deep within the tunnel system. Some penned by Caleb, others by unknown individuals, but signed with his mark. Spanning 1829 to 1841, the correspondence was addressed to shadowy contacts identified only by code names. These weren't personal letters, they were industrial reports, supply requests, and research updates. One letter dated March 15, 1841, confirmed the nightmarish scale of the operation. Current inventory consists of 23 active subjects in various stages of exposure, with 8 nearing termination within the next 3 months. Request additional acquisition of 15 to 20 subjects, preferably in the 20 to 35 age range, for optimal productivity. Recent experiments with controlled exposure protocols have extended average productive lifespan to 22 months, representing significant improvement over previous methods. Recommend coordination with Baltimore and New Orleans contacts to ensure steady supply for expanded operations. These were not the words of a madman. They were logistics from a systematized enterprise. The Hartwells were part of something far more expansive, a structured, multi-state human trafficking and experimentation network that mirrored the efficiency of legitimate industrial supply chains. And if the language of the letters was accurate, this network may have stretched from frontier mines to the heart of the American economy, and perhaps even into government corridors. What truly chilled investigators was not just how long the experiments had gone on, but how successful they had become. The Hartwells had learned to manipulate metal exposure levels with shocking precision. Using rudimentary medicine, mostly folk remedies, bloodletting, and diet, they could delay the onset of acute poisoning. Their workers didn't survive by accident. They survived by design. By 1840, the records showed that the family had moved into a new phase. breeding a workforce. Children born in the mine, raised from birth in controlled toxic environments, were developing a disturbing trait: resistance. These second and third generation individuals tolerated metal poisoning that would have killed their predecessors in weeks. They were smaller, paler, but stronger. In one crucial respect, they could survive underground for years. The Hartwells had created a genetically conditioned slave caste, biologically shaped by exposure and captivity, into perfect laborers for the mine. Even more disturbing was the implication in the letters that the Hartwells were not alone. The correspondence hinted that similar breeding and exposure experiments were occurring in industrial centers across the Republic. Factories, mines, and foundries, all connected by a criminal network as organized as any formal institution. There were references to procurement agents in major cities, encoded mentions of shipments, and vague references to support from federal patrons. Just when investigators believed they had reached the limits of human cruelty, a final revelation turned the entire investigation into something far darker. Guided by the hand-drawn maps recovered from the records, Wickham's railroad team and state authorities descended into the furthest reaches of the Hartwell tunnels. There, buried beneath layers of earth and stone, lay what the documents referred to with chilling indifference as termination chambers. What they found inside would explain the fates of hundreds who had vanished into the mine and challenge everything they thought they knew about the true purpose of the Hartwell operation. If this story has shaken you, share it with someone who appreciates the darkest corners of hidden history. Click that like button to support this deep dive into forgotten crimes, and be sure to subscribe, because what investigators found in those chambers would forever redefine the meaning of horror in America's early frontier. What was the real endgame of the Hartwell family? In the next chapter, we'll explore what lay beyond those final doors. The final chambers of the Hartwell tunnel system were never meant to be found. Hidden behind a 100-yard crawl space cut through solid rock, the passage was barely navigable, seemingly designed not only to prevent escape, but to ensure that no outsider would stumble upon what lay beyond. What investigators discovered there would forever alter the understanding of America's early industrial era and expose one of the most horrifying secret crimes in its history. These were not rough, improvised caverns. The termination chambers, as labeled in Caleb Hartwell's own records, were meticulously constructed clearly, the product of decades of architectural planning and endless human labor. Their purpose was not extraction, but execution. The first section served as a grim medical ward, equipped with crude but functional surgical tools, chemical analysis equipment, and restraint devices. Charts lined the walls documenting the progression of metal poisoning with chilling precision exposure intervals, symptom onset, survival times. The goal here was not to heal, but to prolong suffering just enough to extract the last possible labor and the last possible data before death. Beyond that lay the most damning evidence of all industrialized disposal facilities. The Hartwells had engineered a macabre system for handling the bodies of their expired subjects. There were ash pits, grinding stations, even storage areas. The remains burned, crushed, pulverized, were not buried or hidden. They were sold. Soil samples confirmed it. Human ash and bone meal had been systematically processed into agricultural fertilizer. Records uncovered in this section showed that from 1805 to 1843, the Hartwells had sold remains from over 300 victims to farms across Kentucky and neighboring states. The fertilizer was marketed as an effective yield enhancer. Its true origin unknown to the farmers, who used it to feed their crops, their animals, and their families. The secondary business of selling human remains had become nearly as profitable as the copper trade. Dr. Heinrich Müller's analysis of preserved bone fragments confirmed that the victims had not died quickly or accidentally. They had endured managed poisoning, their symptoms tracked in journals with the same dispassionate clarity as any scientific experiment. Teenagers and young adults made up the bulk of the victims, chosen for their strength, endurance, and long-term viability. Even infants and the elderly were used either for data collection or to disguise deaths as natural. But perhaps the most nightmarish discovery was this: many of the subjects had been kept conscious during their final decline. Journals documented late-stage symptoms in real-time: blurred vision, tremors, hallucinations, organ failure. The agony of death was not just observed, it was measured. And then came the final entry. Dated December 23, 1844, written in a shaky, deteriorated hand, the last journal marked the end of the Hartwell lineage. Last of the outside subjects expired this morning. Thomas and Samuel show advanced symptoms and will not survive the winter. I am the only one remaining capable of maintaining the records. But my hands shake too badly to continue detailed observations. The experiment has been successful beyond our original expectations. We have learned to extend productive life under toxic exposure by an average of 400% compared to natural progression. The techniques we have developed could revolutionize industrial labor if properly implemented. But there is no one left to carry on the work. The bloodline ends with me. See Hartwell III. It was over. The family's own obsession had turned inward. 3 generations of Hartwells had been consumed by the very science they pursued, buried in a tunnel system, soaked in the suffering of hundreds. But when the truth reached state authorities, it triggered panic. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a family secret. It was an open wound in the foundation of American development. Copper from the mine had been used in infrastructure. Fertilizer from human remains had enriched the very fields that fed the frontier. The techniques torture refined into toxicology may have spread far beyond Kentucky. The response was swift, total suppression. The Kentucky government, working with federal officials, classified the entire railroad survey. Engineers were reassigned, sworn to silence. The mine was sealed in concrete and steel, its entrance erased from maps. The land was quietly purchased by a federal trust, now legally untouchable. But the cover-up didn't end there. Using names, codes, and references from the Hartwell correspondents' secret federal investigations traced the outlines of a wider network. They found similar sites in Pennsylvania, Virginia, Tennessee, even as far west as California and Colorado. The Hartwell mine had not been an anomaly. It had been a node in a much larger system, and somewhere perhaps in the shadows of another forgotten hillside, another sealed tunnel may still be hiding its own chapters of unspeakable history. This is where the story darkens beyond myth. Because what the Hartwells began wasn't just horror, it was legacy. One that still might linger in the foundations of America's industrial success. And the question remains, how much of our history was built on bones we were never meant to find? Stay tuned for what lies beyond the official records as we explore the lingering whispers of the Hartwell legacy and whether it ever truly ended. The Hartwell mine wasn't an anomaly, it was the tip of a vast hidden machine. A node in a national network of systematic human experimentation that may have helped power America's rapid industrial rise. As Dr. Mueller's federally overseen investigation unfolded, the true implications shook the foundation of historical understanding. The torture chambers beneath Kentucky weren't isolated horrors, they were part of a broader system. One built on suffering, but whose profits and discoveries were folded seamlessly into the machinery of American progress. The techniques developed in the Hartwell mine, managing toxic exposure, maximizing labor output under deadly conditions, and even disposing of human remains for secondary profit, weren't left in the tunnels. They were used. They were integrated. They worked. And they contributed horrifyingly to the efficiency gains that defined early American industry. The profits from these operations were laundered into legitimate businesses, banks, and federal bonds. Money made through torture helped build the financial foundation of American capitalism. Copper from Hartwell lined the roofs of Washington, D.C. buildings, wired early telegraph systems, and armored naval vessels. The processed remains of the mine's victims, reduced to ash and bone meal, were sold as fertilizer, enriching the farms that fed a growing nation. Some Kentucky soils, tested generations later, still carry trace heavy metals, ghosts of tortured lives, feeding crops that nourished a country. Mueller's analysis of other regions unearthed disturbing correlations. At least 12 sites were flagged as possible parallels, unexplained mass graves in Pennsylvania's coal towns, ironworks in Virginia where productivity mysteriously soared while worker death rates climbed. Copper mines in Tennessee connected to trafficking routes. A nationwide pattern was emerging, but it never came to light. In 1847, federal authorities made a decision: suppress everything. The evidence threatened to undermine trust in American governance economics and the myth of frontier heroism. The investigations were terminated. Records sealed under national security statutes. The public narrative was rewritten: geological instability, family relocation, natural hazards of frontier life. The Hartwell site was erased. Maps were redrawn. The tunnels sealed with steel and concrete. The land was transferred to a federal trust and designated a protected wildlife preserve, one guarded not by conservationists, but by federal agents. The real reason: to bury permanently the physical evidence of a secret that could unravel the national story. Those who had witnessed the initial discovery were silenced, reassigned, relocated, or subtly pressured into forgetting. Over time, local stories warped into folklore. The truth decayed into haunted mine tales and whispers of strange sounds in the hills. But the land remembers. In 1987, pipeline construction unearthed human remains near the Hartwell claim remains, showing classic signs of metal poisoning. The project was quietly rerouted, the bones reburied without autopsy. In 2003, geological scans for a housing development revealed a subterranean complex of unusual size. Preliminary investigation uncovered organic material. Development was canceled. The site was sealed once more. The final conclusion, hidden in federal archives, was damning. Hartwell was not alone. It was a model, a prototype, a success, and the most terrifying implication: the knowledge extracted through torture and experimentation did not die with the Hartwells. It lived on, refined, anonymized, and incorporated into legitimate industrial practices that helped shape the modern American economy. Today, the victims of the Hartwell mine have no memorials, no names in the history books. They are not taught in classrooms, not etched into plaques. Their legacy exists only in the invisible trace elements in the soil, copper, in forgotten infrastructure, and sealed records stored in federal vaults marked classified. The story forces a question that no one in power wants to answer. How many other Hartwells were there? How many lives were sacrificed for invisible gains? And how deeply is their suffering woven into the infrastructure of our lives? As you reflect on this story, consider the possibility that history's greatest crimes are not the ones we remember, but the ones we were never allowed to know. And ask yourself, if this much horror was buried beneath a single hillside in Kentucky, what else might still be hidden in the quiet corners of our country? If you want to uncover more dark chapters like this, real stories that challenge the myths we've been told, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. What do you think happened to the people who disappeared into places like the Hartwell mine? And what else might still be buried just beneath the surface? We'll explore that next time. Until then, stay curious and stay unsettled. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.